Ibn Sina, like his predecessors, also has a philosophical view of happiness. His view of happiness is discussed in the last section of his work, Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, in which he focuses on issues very close to Sufism. And indeed, when discussing happiness, Ibn Sina focuses on the happiness experienced by Arifun or Gnostics. Happiness in Ibn Sina's view is a mental condition, so that each soul has a different object and a state of happiness. This also applies to suffering despite the opposite of happiness. Moreover, according to him, happiness is identical with pleasure, a state when the soul essentially experiences a conformity and compatibility with certain objects. Quote, "It is important to know that every soul has its own special pleasure and goodness and its specific sufferings and wickedness. For instance, sensual pleasure can be obtained in a way that accord with the five senses. Emotional pleasures can be obtained with victory, asymmetric pleasures when wishes are granted, and the pleasure of memory is to recall things pertaining to the past. Suffering is the opposite." First of all, Ibn Sina divides pleasure into three: sensual pleasures, inner pleasures, intellectual pleasures. This division is inseparable from Ibn Sina's division of the soul. According to Ibn Sina, sensual pleasure is the domain of the empirical or physical pleasure. All pleasures that depend on one's self-faculties belong to this lowest level of pleasure. The five senses are the main means of being able to feel this kind of pleasure, and physical objects are the focus. For example, the sense of smell feels pleasure when smelling the fragrance of roses. The sense of touch feels pleasure when touching soft objects. The sense of hearing feels pleasure when listening to melodious sound. The sense of taste feels pleasure when tasting delicious food. And the sense of sight feels pleasure when looking at something beautiful and charming. In Ibn Sina's view, this kind of pleasure is at the lowest level, even at the most despicable level, especially when one dares to claim that this is the highest happiness. For Ibn Sina, those who proclaim that sensual pleasures are the pinnacle of happiness are nothing more than poor people. These poor people, in Ibn Sina's view, are not those who don't have property or money, but those who exhibit their mental poverty by assuming material and sensual things to be the main source and the goal of happiness. Quote, "It is important for us to pay attention to the statements of the person who says, if we were in condition where we didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't marry, then surely we wouldn't find happiness anymore. Regarding that statement, then say to him, O poor, the conditions experienced by the angels or rank above them are more pleasant and enjoyable than those experienced by livestock. There is no way we can compare the two. To claim that sensual and physical pleasures are the end of the pursuit of happiness is a mental poverty that we should avoid. Undeniably, as the lowest form of pleasure, sensual pleasures are nothing more than human expressions that need to be elevated. Above the level of sensual pleasure, there is inner pleasure. This inner pleasure doesn't arise because of physical objects coming through our five senses, but through our psychological side. This kind of pleasure, for example, arises when our work gets appreciated by others, or the hopes we long for have come true, or we become winners in a race, and the like. This kind of pleasure, according to Ibn Sina, comes from the faculties of our animal soul. People who in competitive situations, such as chess for instance, have a chance to win will refuse when offered the temptation of food or sex. Others whose life goals are leadership and chastity will naturally resist the temptation. People of generosity and nobility prefer the opportunity to act generously over indulgence in sensual pleasures. Those who are proud will consider hunger and thirst trivial when compared to their dignity and self-esteem. This shows that inner pleasures are above sensual pleasures, which occur only for a moment. Despite its position above sensual pleasures, inner pleasures are still below intellectual pleasures. Ibn Sina positions intellectual pleasures as the highest of the two pleasures mentioned earlier. The reason is that inner pleasures still rest on the animal soul, particularly on the faculty of perception, imagination, and estimation, while intellectual pleasures entirely pivot on the rational soul. The intellectual pleasures can be achieved when the human soul can grasp the objects of the intelligible perfectly. In other words, once the human soul has been able to grasp intelligible objects, then that person will feel the peak of incomparable happiness, even he can be a part of the perfection. Ibn Sina states, the special perfection of the rational soul is found in the intellectual realm, on which universal forms and intelligible objects are reflected as a whole. For Ibn Sina, when the rational soul reached the limit of its perfection, the analogy is like a person who is deaf for the rest of his life, and then he listens to a very melodious song. Where the deafness has vanished, he must have felt an extraordinary and incomparable pleasure that he has never felt before. This analogy shows that intellectual pleasure is a form of pleasure that cannot be found in both sensual pleasure and mental pleasure, so that one who has not experienced it can never describe or depict this kind of pleasure. It is on this level that Ibn Sina views intellectual pleasures as happiness. So then how can one attain the happiness at the highest level? Ibn Sina's answer is tazkiyatun nafs, self-purification. Here Ibn Sina positions himself as a Sufi, not as a peripatetic philosopher who glorifies the power of reason. According to him, self-purification must be done in two ways, theoretically and practically. These two ways must go hand in hand in the process, so that the soul can reach the light of enlightenment and attain the pinnacle of happiness that is coveted. In Ibn Sina's own words, the happiness of the soul is in the perfection of its substance. This is done by purifying oneself both theoretically and practically. Self-purification in a practical way is to purify oneself from despicable morals and bad habits according to reason and religion. After cleansing all, a person then adorns himself with good habits and commendable morals according to reason and religion. Meanwhile, self-purification in a theoretical way is carried out in order to obtain malaka, habituation, with which it is ready to present all objects of reason at any time without any effort. So the objects of reason are all obtained actually or potentially, which leads to actuality. Thus the soul is like a clear mirror that can reflect the shape of everything as it is. When the soul gets theoretical purification, it achieves mastery over the theoretical wisdom. Ibn Sina explains that if the human soul doesn't purify its substance and it has bad and despicable habits, then it becomes something more despised than animals. On the other hand, the soul will be clean and pure if one purifies his soul through the theoretical and practical perfection, with the result that the soul can resemble the highest being, that is, angels. The purified soul will give rise to three virtues. First, the moderate act called Iffah, the self-control free of the two extremes between excess and lack. Second, courage, which is the moderate act between cowardice and recklessness in doing something. Third, the nature of wisdom, which is an act reflecting high concern in the human dimension. Ibn Sina said the three virtues are called justice. Justice is a combination of these three virtues. Whoever has this, especially if he has theoretical wisdom, that is the knowledge of the nature of things, of course he will be a perfect person practically and theoretically, and he belongs to the group of as-sabiqun. Ibn Sina names those who have attained happiness al-arif, Gnostic, and those who have arrived at this station occupy the pure realm, alamul quds, and taste happiness, as-sa'adah. Surely in themselves there is the highest perfection, al-kamalul a'la, so that they can taste the highest pleasure, al-ladha al-aliyah. See you soon.